The wooden door of the small Jerusalem synagogue creaked open at exactly 7:30 in the morning. Rabbi Yosef Kleinman stepped inside, his black coat still damp from the rain. He moved toward the ark with practiced familiarity, his fingers brushing against the velvet curtain. Outside, 3 cars sat parked at odd angles along the narrow street. Inside each one, a Mossad surveillance team watched every movement through tinted windows. Kleinman didn't know it yet, but in 90 seconds, his entire carefully constructed life would collapse. He reached for the prayer book on the 3rd shelf. His hand hesitated. Something felt wrong. The book was in the wrong position, rotated slightly counterclockwise. It was a detail no one else would notice, but Kleinman noticed everything. That's what kept him alive for 3 years, operating inside Israel's most secure city. He turned slowly, scanning the empty room. Morning light filtered through the stained glass, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. His heart rate climbed. Training kicked in. He cataloged his exits, the main door behind him, the side passage to the rabbi's study, the narrow stairwell leading to the storage basement. All standard, all familiar. But something had changed. His eyes moved to the corner near the bookshelves. A small brass menorah sat on the windowsill. Yesterday, it had been centered. Now it leaned slightly to the left, catching the light at a different angle. The kind of shift that happens when someone moves it to install something behind it. Kleinman's throat tightened. He was a professional. He knew what surveillance preparation looked like. Someone had been here overnight. Someone had touched his space. He made his decision in 2 seconds. Keep moving, act natural, never show panic. He opened the prayer book and began reading aloud in Hebrew, his voice steady and practiced. The words of the morning blessing filled the small room, but his mind raced through protocols. Extraction, roads, dead drops, emergency signals. 3 years of operational training compressed into one brutal calculation. Was he already compromised, or was this routine security? Outside, in the lead surveillance car, a Mossad officer named Dalia Meir pressed her earpiece tighter and whispered into her radio. He noticed the menorah. He's running scenarios. Her partner glanced at the photograph clipped to the dashboard. Same face, same careful movements. Same man who had spent 36 months teaching Torah studies, conducting weddings, comforting grieving families, and embedding himself so deeply into Jerusalem's religious community that even the Shin Bet security service had initially cleared him. Dahlia checked her watch. The raid team was 90 seconds out. Inside the synagogue, Kleinman closed the prayer book. His hand moved toward his coat pocket, where a small ceramic tile hid a micro SD card containing 3 years of intelligence. Israeli Defense Force troop rotations and security, protocols for government buildings, encrypted communication frequencies, and the home addresses of 14 Mossad officers. He never reached the pocket. The door exploded inward. 6 Shin Bet operatives in tactical gear flooded the room, weapons raised. Kleinman's hands went up automatically, muscle memory overriding panic. They had him on the ground in 4 seconds, face pressed against cold stone, wrists zip-tied behind his back. One of the officers pulled the ceramic tile from his pocket and held it up to the light. Dalia Meir walked through the door, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She looked down at the man on the floor, the man who had fooled an entire community, the man who had almost gotten away with one of the most brazen intelligence penetrations in Israeli history. She crouched beside him and spoke quietly in Persian. "Salam, Major Reza. Welcome home." The man who had called himself Rabbi Yosef Kleinman closed his eyes. How did an Iranian intelligence officer manage to operate undetected for 3 years inside one of the most surveilled cities on Earth, posing as a Jewish religious leader? And how did Mossad finally catch him when every formal check had failed? To understand how deep this operation went, you need to understand what Reza Ahmadi had accomplished. This wasn't a tourist overstaying a visa. This wasn't a businessman gathering economic intelligence. This was a hostile intelligence officer from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, living and working inside Jerusalem, while Israel's entire security apparatus operated around him. The operation began 4 years earlier in a training facility outside Tehran. The MOs had identified a critical vulnerability in Israeli counterintelligence. Despite decades of experience detecting Arab infiltrators and Palestinian operatives, Israeli security agencies had almost no experience identifying Persian nationals posing as Mizrahi Jews, Jews whose families had lived in Middle Eastern countries for generations before immigrating to Israel. The linguistic overlap was the key. Many Mizrahi Jewish families had lived in Iran, Iraq, and Yemen for centuries. They spoke Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew. Their cultural mannerisms, their food, their music, all of it blurred the line between Iranian Muslim and Iranian Jew in ways that made detection extraordinarily difficult. Reza Ahmadi fit the profile perfectly. Born in Isfahan to a secular family, he spoke fluent Persian and serviceable Arabic. He was 32 years old, unmarried, physically unremarkable. Most importantly, he had studied comparative religion at university with a specific focus on Jewish theology and practice. That academic background became his cover foundation. The MOIs spent 18 months preparing him. He underwent rabbinical training with an exiled Iranian Jewish scholar who had left Israel decades earlier under mysterious circumstances. He memorized prayers, studied Talmudic commentary, learned the rhythms of Shabbat services and holiday observances. He practiced until every movement felt natural, until the Hebrew blessings flowed without conscious thought. But the real challenge wasn't religious knowledge. It was creating a bulletproof legend, a false identity so thoroughly documented that it could survive Israeli security vetting. The MOs used a real person as the template. Yosef Kleinman had existed. He was born in Tehran in 1986 to a Jewish family that emigrated to Israel in 1994 during a brief window when Iranian Jews could still leave relatively freely. The real Yosef Kleinman had died in a car accident in Tel Aviv in 2003 at age 17. His death was documented, but the family had been secular and disconnected from the religious community. No one was watching his identity after burial. Iranian intelligence obtained his birth records, school documents, and family registration paperwork through corruption networks inside Iranian government archives. They created a narrative. Yosef had survived the accident but suffered memory loss and trauma. He spent years in rehabilitation abroad, first in Turkey, then in Eastern Europe, reconnecting with his faith during his recovery. The beauty of the cover was its verifiability. Every document checked out because the original person had been real. The gaps in the timeline were explainable through medical, trauma, and displacement. In 2019, the operation entered its final phase. Reza Ahmadi became Yosef Kleinman. He flew to Istanbul, then to Athens, building a travel history that looked like a struggling immigrant searching for stability. He made contact with Jewish community organizations in Greece, establishing references. He attended synagogue services, asked questions, showed interest in returning to Israel. When he finally applied for Israeli citizenship under the law of return, which grants automatic citizenship to any Jewish person, his application was flagged for routine security review. Shin Bet investigators checked his documents. They interviewed him in Hebrew. They verified his family records against archived immigration data. Everything matched. In December 2019, Yosef Kleinman returned to Israel as a citizen. He settled in Jerusalem, took a modest apartment in a religious neighborhood, and began attending a small Sephardic synagogue. He was quiet, respectful, eager to rebuild his life in the homeland. Within 6 months, the community embraced him. Within a year, he was assisting the aging rabbi with administrative duties. Within 18 months, he was leading services and teaching basic Torah classes to children. And all the while, he was collecting intelligence, photographing documents, recording conversations, mapping security patterns, identifying targets for future MO's operations. The operation was a masterpiece of patience and tradecraft. But it had one flaw, one microscopic detail that would eventually unravel everything. Reza Ahmadi had been too perfect. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired Mossad analyst named Avner Shalem had spent 30 years studying Iranian intelligence operations. He had tracked MOS officers across 3 continents, learned their patterns, understood their operational signatures. When he retired in 2021, he thought he was done. But Avner couldn't let go. He spent his retirement reading intelligence reports, attending security conferences, staying connected to former colleagues. He had developed an instinct for Iranian tradecraft, a sixth sense for when something felt too clean, too perfectly arranged. In early 2022, he was having coffee with a former Shin Bet officer who mentioned a minor curiosity. During routine background checks of synagogue personnel in Jerusalem, one file had stood out for being remarkably complete. No gaps, no inconsistencies, no missing documentation. Every question had a perfect answer. That phrase triggered something in Avner's mind. Too perfect. He asked to see the file. It took 3 weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering, but eventually he got access. The name was Yosef Kleinman. Born Tehran, immigrated as a child, returned after years abroad following trauma and recovery. Avner read through the documents slowly. Birth certificate from Tehran Civil Registry. School records showing enrollment in Israeli elementary school. Medical records from a car accident in 2003. Hospital discharge papers from a Turkish rehabilitation facility. Travel stamps from Greece. Interviews with rabbis who had met him in Athens. Everything documented. Everything verified. Everything perfect. He started digging deeper. He requested the original death certificate from the 2003 car accident. It existed, filed properly in Tel Aviv Municipal Archives. He cross-referenced the hospital that had treated the real Yosef Kleinman after the crash. The records matched, but then Avner did something most analysts wouldn't think to do. He requested the grave location. It took 2 days to get the cemetery records. When they arrived, Avner stared at the document for a long time. Yosef Kleinman was buried in a family plot in Holon, a city south of Tel Aviv. The grave had been maintained. Flowers were placed there regularly by distant relatives. Avner called one of those relatives, an elderly cousin who remembered the family. They talked for 30 minutes about the tragedy, about the young boy who died too soon. Then Avner asked a simple question. Did anyone from the family stay in contact with him before the accident? Any letters? Any photos from when he was older? The cousin paused. What do you mean, older? Yosef died when he was 17. Avner felt his pulse quicken. Of course. I meant any photos from right before the accident. We have some from the funeral. Why? Avner thanked her and hung up. He sat in his kitchen for 20 minutes working through the logic. Someone had taken a dead teenager's identity and aged it forward. Someone had created a perfect legend by resurrecting a real person who could no longer contradict the story, but that someone had made one critical error. They assumed no one would verify the death itself. Avner wrote a detailed memo and sent it to 3 former colleagues still active in Mossad. He laid out his suspicion. The man currently serving as a rabbi's assistant in Jerusalem might be an Iranian intelligence officer using a stolen identity. The memo landed on Dalia Meir's desk 2 days later. She was a case officer in Mossad's counterintelligence division, responsible for identifying foreign intelligence operations inside Israel. She read Avner's analysis twice. Then she opened a surveillance request. The operation to investigate Rabbi Yosef Kleinman began quietly in March 2022. Dalia assembled a small team, just 4 officers initially. They started with passive observation, watching his routines, tracking his movements, noting his contacts. For the first month, they found nothing unusual. Kleinman followed a predictable schedule. Morning prayers, afternoon study sessions, evening visits to families in the community. He lived modestly, spent little money, kept no suspicious contacts. But Dalia wasn't looking for obvious mistakes, she was looking for the absence of mistakes. She noticed that Kleinman never used a personal phone except for basic calls. He never accessed the internet from home. He never traveled outside Jerusalem without notifying the synagogue in advance. His life was almost monastically controlled. That level of discipline didn't fit someone who had supposedly spent years recovering from trauma. It fit someone operating under strict intelligence protocols. Dalia authorized the next level of surveillance: technical penetration. The team installed audio devices in his apartment while he was at services. They accessed his computer and cloned his hard drive. They tracked every digital footprint. What they found was chilling in its emptiness. No personal emails, no social media, no entertainment browsing. His computer contained only religious texts and educational materials. But hidden in the metadata of several Word documents, the technical team found something. Creation dates from computers with IP addresses registered in Turkey and Greece, exactly matching the locations in his cover story. Someone had prepared these documents in advance, staged them to look like organic personal files. Dahlia knew they were close, but close wasn't enough. She needed proof of active intelligence activity. She needed to catch him in the act. That's when the team made a critical decision. They would run a provocation operation designed to force Kleinman into making contact with his handlers. The plan was elegant and brutal. If Kleinman was a dormant intelligence asset, he would have protocols for emergency communication with his MOS handlers. Those protocols would be triggered only under specific circumstances: imminent arrest, compromised identity, or an intelligence opportunity too valuable to miss. Dahlia decided to give him that opportunity. In late August 2022, Mossad created a fake crisis. They leaked information through controlled channels suggesting that a high-level Iranian defector was being debriefed in Tel Aviv. The defector supposedly had information about MOS operations inside Israel, including details about a penetration of the religious community. The information was designed to be vague enough to seem credible, but specific enough to trigger panic in any Iranian operative working in that sector. They seeded the story carefully. A journalist with known intelligence connections published a cryptic article mentioning Israeli security concerns about foreign influence in Jerusalem synagogues. A Shin Bet officer mentioned the defector in a conversation at a cafe known to be under surveillance by multiple foreign services. Then they waited. Kleinman's behavior changed within 48 hours. The surveillance team noted increased nervousness. He began checking his surroundings more frequently. He altered his walking routes. He visited the synagogue at odd hours, always alone. On the third night after the planted story broke, Kleinman left his apartment at 2 a.m. The surveillance team followed him through the empty streets of Jerusalem. He walked for 20 minutes, doubling back twice using counter-surveillance techniques. He stopped at a public park and sat on a bench. He stayed there for 11 minutes, not moving. Then he stood, walked to a waste bin, and dropped something inside. The moment he left, a Mossad technical officer retrieved the item. It was a small piece of paper wrapped around a coin. On the paper, written in tiny script, was a message in Farsi: possible compromise, request guidance, emergency protocol. The team had their proof. Kleinman was an active intelligence officer attempting to contact his handlers. But Dahlia didn't move to arrest him immediately. She wanted more. She wanted to identify his communication network, his dead drop locations, potentially even his Iranian case officer. The team watched the waste bin for 3 days. On the 4th night, a man appeared. He was Iranian, traveling on a Turkish passport, supposedly a businessman visiting Israel for a trade conference. He retrieved the coin and paper, replaced it with a new message, and disappeared into the night. Mossad grabbed him at the airport 6 hours later. In a secure interrogation room, he broke within 2 hours. He wasn't intelligence. He was a courier, paid to pick up and deliver messages without knowing their content. He gave them the delivery protocol. Messages were to be left at a specific location in East Jerusalem, photographed and uploaded to an encrypted server. Mossad now controlled the communication channel. Dahlia wrote a response in Farsi, mimicking the terse style of intelligence communications. Maintain position. Defector unrelated to your operation. Heightened security temporary. Continue normal activities. They placed the message and watched Kleinman retrieve it 2 nights later. His behavior normalized immediately. The panic subsided. He returned to his careful routine. But now the team knew exactly what they were dealing with. This wasn't a lone wolf gathering information opportunistically. This was a long-term penetration operation run by MOS with active handler communication and emergency protocols. Dahlia made her recommendation to Mossad leadership. Let the operation continue under controlled conditions. Learn everything possible about MOI's tradecraft and objectives, then roll up the network when they had maximum intelligence value. Her superiors disagreed. The risk of leaving a hostile intelligence officer active inside Jerusalem was too high. They ordered immediate arrest. On September 14, 2022, Dalia received authorization to execute the takedown. The operation would happen in the synagogue, at the moment of maximum symbolic impact. An Iranian spy posing as a Jewish rabbi, arrested in the act of prayer. The team spent 3 days preparing. They installed cameras and microphones throughout the building. They briefed the tactical arrest team. They coordinated with Shin Bet to ensure no other security services would interfere. Everything was ready. And that's how Reza Ahmadi, who had successfully operated for 3 years as Rabbi Yosef Kleinman, ended up face down on a synagogue floor with his wrists zip-tied and his cover completely destroyed. The interrogation of Reza Ahmadi lasted 19 days. It took place in a secure facility outside Tel Aviv, in rooms designed specifically for hostile intelligence debriefings. Dalia Meir led the questioning, supported by Persian language specialists and psychological operations experts. Ahmadi was a professional. He refused to speak for the first 72 hours, maintaining the fiction that he was Yosef Kleinman, a traumatized immigrant being wrongly persecuted. He demanded lawyers, recited his rights under Israeli law, and showed no emotion. But Mossad had prepared thoroughly. On the 4th day, they played him recordings of his own voice from the surveillance devices in his apartment. Private moments when he spoke to himself in Persian, using phrases and idioms specific to Isfahan dialect. Moments when his guard was down. They showed him photographs of the coin dead drop, of the courier, of the encrypted message protocols. They presented evidence of his computer metadata, of documents prepared in Turkey before he ever arrived in Israel. And then Dalia did something unexpected. She placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs of the real Yosef Kleinman, a teenager smiling at a beach. A family photo from before the car accident. A grave marker in Holon. She spoke quietly in Persian. The boy you stole was 17 when he died. His mother still visits his grave every year on his birthday. You dishonored his memory. You used his death as a tool. Something shifted in Ahmadi's expression. Not guilt, but recognition that the psychological warfare had begun in earnest. Over the next 2 weeks, Dalia slowly extracted his story. Not through torture or threats, but through careful manipulation of his professional pride and his isolation. She offered him a choice: cooperate and provide intelligence about MO's operations, or spend the rest of his life in an Israeli prison with no acknowledgement from Iran that he had ever existed. Ahmadi understood intelligence realities. Iran would deny him, disavow the operation, and move on. He had no leverage, no hope of exchange or rescue. He began talking. He confirmed the 18-month preparation in Tehran, the selection of Kleinman's identity, the creation of the legend. He described the MO's training protocols, surveillance detection, encrypted communication, tradecraft for operating in hostile territory. He revealed his intelligence collection priorities: Israeli Defense Force unit deployments in the West Bank, security protocols at Jerusalem government buildings, identification of Mossad officers and their family members, mapping of emergency response patterns. He had collected over 2,000 photographs, recorded hundreds of hours of conversations, and identified 14 intelligence officers through careful observation of behavior patterns and vehicle movements. But the most valuable intelligence wasn't about what he had collected. It was about MO's methodology. Ahmadi described how Iran had systematically identified dead or disappeared Jewish immigrants whose families had loose ties to Israel. They created a database of potential identities that could be resurrected with minimal risk of discovery. Kleinman wasn't the first. He was part of a program. Mossad realized they were dealing with multiple possible penetrations. Dalia asked the critical question, how many others are active in Israel right now? Ahmadi hesitated. Professional loyalty warred with self-preservation. Finally, he spoke. I only knew of my own operation, but the training facility handled multiple candidates simultaneously. At least 6 others were in advanced preparation when I deployed. The interrogation ended on October 3, 2022. Ahmadi was transferred to permanent detention in a secure facility where Iran could never verify his location or status. He would spend the rest of his life in isolation, a ghost to the world he had tried to infiltrate. Mossad immediately launched a massive counterintelligence sweep. They cross-referenced every Jewish immigrant from Iran or other Middle Eastern countries who had returned to Israel in the past decade. They re-examined documentation, re-interviewed community members, and conducted invasive background checks. Over the next 8 months, they identified 2 additional suspects. Both had similar profiles: perfect documentation, gaps explained by medical or personal trauma, religious community integration. One was arrested in Haifa in March 2023. The other disappeared before Mossad could move, suggesting he had been warned through some undetected communication channel. The operation exposed a fundamental vulnerability in Israeli immigration security. The law of return, designed to welcome Jewish refugees and immigrants, had become an exploitation vector for hostile intelligence services. Israel quietly revised its vetting procedures. They implemented DNA verification for immigrants claiming Jewish heritage from high-risk countries. They extended background check timelines and added psychological profiling to detect overly controlled behavior patterns. The Kleinman case forced a brutal question. How do you protect an open society from those who weaponize its openness? The exposure of Reza Ahmadi as Rabbi Yosef Kleinman sent shockwaves through Israeli intelligence and security communities, but it was never publicly announced. The Israeli government made a calculated decision to keep the operation classified. No press conference, no public trial, no acknowledgement that an Iranian spy had successfully penetrated Jerusalem for 3 years. The reasoning was strategic. Confirming the operation would reveal Israeli counterintelligence capabilities and force Iran to change its methodology. Silence was more valuable than public vindication. But within intelligence circles, the operation became a case study in deception, identity theft, and the exploitation of cultural overlap. It changed how Mossad and Shin Bet approached immigrant vetting, how they assessed threats from state actors willing to invest years in patient penetration operations. The human cost was harder to quantify. The small synagogue community that had embraced Kleinman felt betrayed and violated. Families who had invited him into their homes, who had trusted him with their children's religious education, struggled to reconcile the warm, gentle Rabbi they knew with the cold reality of a foreign intelligence officer. One congregant, interviewed anonymously by Israeli security for psychological impact assessment, said something that haunted Dahlia Meir long after the operation ended. He blessed my son at his bar mitzvah. He held my hand when my father died. How do I separate those memories from the lie? That's the cruelty of deep cover operations. They don't just steal information. They steal trust, relationships, and the sense of safety that holds communities together. For Mossad, the case reinforced a difficult truth about modern intelligence warfare. State actors like Iran weren't just developing missiles and nuclear programs. They were developing sophisticated human intelligence operations that exploited identity, religion, and cultural vulnerabilities in ways that technology couldn't easily counter. The operation also raised profound ethical questions that intelligence agencies rarely discuss publicly. When Israeli operatives created the provocation that triggered Ahmadi's emergency communication, they manipulated him into confirming his status. That's standard tradecraft. But they also manufactured a fictional defector crisis that terrified every Iranian asset operating in the region, potentially putting innocent people at risk. Intelligence work exists in moral gray zones where the definitions of right and wrong blur under operational necessity. Mossad's mission is to protect Israeli citizens from existential threats. That mission sometimes requires deception, manipulation, and ruthless calculation. But where is the line? When a spy uses a dead teenager's identity to infiltrate a community, that's clearly wrong. When intelligence services detect and arrest that spy, that's clearly justified. But what about everything in between? The surveillance of innocent people who happen to live near the suspect, the infiltration of religious communities to gather intelligence, the use of psychological manipulation during interrogation. Israeli security officials would argue that these methods are necessary in a region where hostile states actively seek Israel's destruction. Iran's Amos runs operations designed to identify assassination targets, map critical infrastructure, and prepare for potential armed conflict. Stopping those operations requires aggressive counterintelligence, but critics, including some retired Israeli intelligence officers, have questioned whether the focus on technical penetration and human intelligence operations distracts from deeper diplomatic and political solutions. If Iran feels threatened enough to run these kinds of long-term operations, what does that say about the broader regional security environment? The Kleinman operation also exposed the vulnerability of diaspora communities. Jewish populations in Middle Eastern countries have historically faced persecution, discrimination, and displacement. Israel was founded partly as a refuge for those communities. But now, hostile intelligence services are weaponizing that history, using it as cover for espionage. That puts Israeli immigration authorities in an impossible position. How do you distinguish between a genuine refugee seeking safety and a trained intelligence officer exploiting that same narrative? How do you protect national security without betraying the core mission of providing sanctuary? Israel's solution has been increased scrutiny, longer vetting timelines, and more invasive background checks. But that comes with a cost. Legitimate immigrants face delays, suspicion, and bureaucratic obstacles. The promise of automatic citizenship under the law of return is now conditional on proving your identity to a degree that previous generations never faced. Some Israeli policymakers have suggested that the law of return should be revised to exclude applicants from hostile countries entirely, but that proposal faced immediate backlash from Jewish community organizations worldwide, who argued that abandoning Jews in dangerous regions would betray Israel's founding principles. It's a debate with no clean answer, a policy challenge shaped by security realities and moral obligations that pull in opposite directions. Perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the Kleinman case is what it revealed about the nature of identity itself. Reza Ahmadi spent 3 years living as Yosef Kleinman. He learned the prayers, observed the rituals, participated in the community. Did some part of him become the person he was pretending to be, or was it always pure performance, a role played with skill but no emotional connection? Intelligence psychologists debate this question endlessly. Deep cover operatives sometimes report feeling psychological fractures, moments where they lose track of which identity is real. Ahmadi underwent rigorous psychological conditioning to prevent that breakdown. But 3 years is a long time to maintain a false identity in an emotionally intense environment. During his interrogation, Dalia asked him if he ever doubted the mission, if he ever felt conflicted about deceiving people who genuinely cared for him. He responded with a question of his own. Did your operatives doubt their missions when they assassinated Iranian scientists? Did they feel conflicted? It was a fair point. Intelligence work, on all sides, requires a capacity for compartmentalization that most people don't possess. The ability to separate professional duty from personal emotion, to commit acts that would be unforgivable in civilian life because you believe in a larger cause. That belief is what sustains operatives in the field and interrogators in secure rooms. But it's also what makes intelligence warfare so endlessly cyclical. Iran runs operations against Israel. Israel runs operations against Iran. Both sides believe they're acting in self-defense, protecting their people from existential threats, and the truth is, they're both right and both wrong at the same time. The Kleinman operation is now filed away in classified Mossad archives, accessible only to analysts studying Iranian intelligence capabilities. Reza Ahmadi remains in detention, his location unknown even to most Israeli security officials. The small synagogue in Jerusalem quietly replaced its assistant rabbi and moved on, though the congregation is smaller now, the trust harder to rebuild. And somewhere in Tehran, MOS officers studied the operation's failure, learned from its mistakes, and began preparing the next generation of penetration assets with even more sophisticated tradecraft. Because that's how intelligence warfare works. Each operation, whether successful or exposed, becomes a lesson for the next one. The game doesn't end, it just evolves. If you found yourself in Dalia Mir's position, running an operation to identify and arrest a hostile intelligence officer embedded in a civilian community, would you have made the same choices? And if you were in Reza Ahmadi's position, believing your country faced existential threats and that your mission was necessary for national survival, could you have maintained that deception for 3 years? These aren't hypothetical questions. Intelligence agencies around the world are asking their officers to make these exact calculations every day, and the rest of us live in the world shaped by those decisions, usually without ever knowing they were made. The line between security and betrayal, between protection and paranoia, is thinner than we'd like to believe. The Kleinman case proved that in the shadows where intelligence work happens, identity itself becomes a weapon, and trust becomes a liability. That's the world of covert operations. That's the reality of modern espionage. And if this story showed you how fragile the line between safety and infiltration really is, subscribe to Hidden Ops for more true missions from the world of intelligence and deception that shapes history from behind closed doors.